Today's segment is the Storytime segment. So we're here to talk about a story and learn about it and analyze it and try to figure out what we can take away from that story, but also the history of it. Today, we are going to be ripping apart the story, The Princess and the Pea. But stick around because that's going to come a little bit later. There's some context and history you need to know about before we get really into The Princess and the Pea. Okay? Then at the very end, I'm going to read to you an original, never shared or published story that I wrote as an alternative Princess and the Pea. And you'll find out why if you stay tuned. All right. Stick around because we're going to get into it. Just like old wives' tales, fairy tales have often been put down, condescended as just fit only for children, fit only to teach about morality, because in the Western culture, fairy tales hold no truth. They might hold a moral truth that you can learn, but according to Western society, fairy tales aren't truth inherently, the way that Western society views, say, the Bible as some kind of literal truth, though not literally. It's kind of been over the last 500 years that the West mostly talks about colonization in response to Western society's attempts to seed colonies through places like North and South America. When we talk about colonization, we're mostly talking about this seeding of colonies through acts of occupation, aggression, and genocide. And when we're talking about literature, stories, okay, we're not just talking about one person's copy of something. Right? We're talking about narratives. These are stories that people carry with them. Like if I am cornered outside right now, my version of The Princess and the Pea will be slightly different or really different, right? It might accidentally blend different versions of the tale together and make like a hybridized version of the story. And that's really natural. That happens with all stories. In an academic sense, we're not completely talking about this post-colonial concept of colonization. I'm talking about forcible assimilation through narrative. Okay? So it's a slightly different concept than academic literary people are talking about, because they're talking about the written word. They're talking about the publications and the people who publish them. There's very specific copyrights, right? associated with stories. So when I want to talk about this, I have to kind of diverge this concept, this Western concept of the narrative, the history. There is no one history. We all have a history. And how we relate to that history is our narrative. Like, that's narrative, okay? Narrative is kind of the plot. It's what is the point of the story? That's narrative. The problem with this, though, is as we get into colonization, as we get into this expansion of Western society, there are key hallmarks in a lot of stories that come up where stories aren't really stories anymore. They're propaganda. And I think that in the context of going into a federal election right now, this is the perfect time to talk about propaganda. What is propaganda? How does it relate to how we tell stories? And what in the West is going on around our stories, especially as women? Let's do it. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the word propaganda as such: information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. And that's kind of another term for narrative. point of view. It's just longer. And kids use the word POV now because they get it. Kids have a whole philosophy around storytelling and POV. They're brilliant. Kids are brilliant. I love kids. All right, so that's the definition according to Oxford. But a term like propaganda just doesn't come out of nowhere. It's only part of the story. So let's really quickly do a review on the origin of the term propaganda. Where did it come from? Sure, we kind of understand what the word propaganda means, especially during an election, right? We know that people are pushing their own stories, their own narratives, their own agendas. And we know that propaganda has a lot to do with political strategy, right? Let's talk a little bit about propaganda because it comes from a really interesting historical event. In the year 1622, Pope Gregory XV established a committee of cardinals, not the birds, okay? This committee of cardinals was called the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, and it was set within the Roman tradition and controlled by the Roman Curia. In Latin, it was properly called Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, which shows how we've got this word in English. This committee, the title, is Congregatio de Propaganda Fide. Propaganda. It actually is the Latin word for propagate. And fide, okay, is faith. So, propagation of faith. And as spring and Easter is coming up, I actually think this is perfect symbolism for what's going on here around this word, propaganda. Because the concept of propagation is kind of like spring cleaning. You have to remove all the waste around the garden bed. You have to turn over the soil, depending on your crop. And then you plant new seeds. And this is kind of the age-old, I know there's new ways of gardening, okay? Don't hit me with all these gardening things, okay? I love you. Don't hit me with the gardening stuff. We're not talking about actual gardening. We're talking about the term propagation and the idea of propagation. So you're thinking gardening, that's fine. Throw it in the bin. Let's put our thoughts on the old world idea. And if you've ever read the Bible, you'll know that there's a proverb that Jesus actually shares. And it's the proverb of the sower who sows seeds. And so in the Christian faith, there's this philosophy that faith and spiritual connection to the universe and God is grown through tender care, the way that we would tenderly care for plants and animals. Okay, so that's really important. But this also kind of links the idea of propagation and propaganda as something way older. If Jesus is already talking about sowing seeds onto ground and trying to find proper fertile ground, not rock and sandy stuff, he's trying to educate the illiterate people around him about propagation. And he's also trying to talk about, because he's in the Bible, he's not telling them how to grow food. He's talking about how to develop a balanced faith life, in essence. And he's also trying to talk about how to avoid the pitfalls of the afterlife. Like, back then, they didn't have concepts of hell like we have today, the fire and brimstone. So by the time you get to the 1600s, they've been analyzing this story so long that when these concepts of fire and brimstone do pop up during, the Spanish Inquisition and the Reformation, Spanish Inquisition, and so forth, you have people who are associating hell with a really bad place and like punishment and such. And this is also kind of even more ancient than that, because if they're referencing Jesus, by the time we get to the story of the Princess and the Pea, and we're talking about growth and propagation and propaganda and that history, then we're actually talking about a very long human history, because no matter what nation you belong to, no matter what society you belong to. Peoples tend to come to agriculture and animal husbandry naturally. We tend to discover it. And I don't think we do discover it. I think we like befriend a cat and then we notice that they catch mice. Yay, let's keep cats around because they'll eat all the mice and we'll get to make bread without mouse feces, right? Like there's this kind of connection in the world that exists before today. Today we have this academic understanding of the world, you know, cause and effect and all of these rules about the universe and physics. But in the 1600s, they didn't have that. They still thought that the sun revolved around the earth. So you can see here how certain cause and effects get lost. And language is no different. Language is no different. Although we're using the ancient Latin word for propagation, right? We're also using it as an English word for propaganda. I am not an encyclopedia. I merely sound like one. Let's consult the Oxford English Dictionary again. Propagation is the breeding of specimens of a plant or animal by natural processes from the parent stock. And so you can see here too, that at this point, using the term propagation has to do with objects. These are nouns. They aren't verbs. They aren't people doing and creating. Propagation is this like creation of an object. Because at this time, plants aren't sentient. A lot of people are not pantheistic. We're heading into the 1600s for this story. So we're talking about a time where having anything that doesn't look Christian is going to get you killed. Okay? And the propagation of the faith, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but in essence, that committee that was created for the propagation of the faith, they would be in effect until like the 1800s because it was about sending out missionaries. It was about like the second definition of propagation in the Oxford English Dictionary, right under the first one I just said, is the action of widely spreading and promoting an idea, theory, etc. We're basically dead on this concept where, especially when you realize that the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith has an initial goal when established by Pope Gregory to support the Curia's work in organizing and directing missionary work. And the year it was established, 1622, this period is rife with violence between Western states, not only because of colonial expansion, but because Western society was in active ideological warfare. King James I and VI, technically, he's the one that rewrote the Bible. And he rewrote it in ways that I think one day we'll get into, because it really does have to do with a huge shift in how women are seen by the church. He was Protestant and dissolved Parliament in England in the same year, 1622, which means that the people of Scotland and England had no representation or advocates in their government. This year was also surrounded by warfare in European society. The 30 Years' War was in its third year. France had to put down a rebellion, which resulted in the Treaty of Montpellier and the Edict of Nantes. As a settler living in North America, I would be remiss too if I didn't mention the following. This year, 1622, was also the year of the massacre of English settlers in the colony of Virginia. These are huge ideological problems, creating conflict, not only within the world, but also between Western states like France, England, Scotland. And as this happens, the violence is still ramping up, and it's going up, and it's going up, and it's going up. I want to get to the tale of the Princess and the Pea, but I have one more thing to tell you about. Now that we've kind of talked about propaganda and how it becomes this story that can support your goals, the way that colonial stories supported colonial action. let's move on, because we have to talk about fairy tales before we can talk about the fairy tale. In addition to the act of propaganda, we need to see not only fairy tales, but also what's happening in literary society, because literature is one form of having a conversation. And while propaganda is a form of communication, after the invention of the printing press, propaganda was very easily printable. It was very easily put onto paper. So if we fast forward to 1650, this is the year that our collective fairy godmother was born. Marie-Catharine de Neuil was a French woman who, at 15 years old, so still a child by Western society standards, and by our understanding today, but back then, if she had her period, she was marriageable, period. And to put it into perspective, this might be too much information for you, but this is where I shine. I would have been marriageable at the age of 10 because that's when I first got my period. So at this point in time, in the 1600s, women are switching in the mind's eye. They're no longer people. They're kind of becoming property. And that's actually a key theme in King James's version of the Bible. If you do a comparison between different versions of the Bible, the King James version actually changes the 10 Commandments, so that Protestants have one set of 10 Commandments and Catholics have a slightly different set of 10 Commandments. And so the laws that are kind of like the basics that everyone should know now are different. And one of these differences is that the commandment that says you should not covet thy neighbor's goods, and then it's separated, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, in Catholic or International Version Bibles, those are separate. They're separate things. Those are separate commandments. They're interpreted as separate. A wife is not a property. A property is not a person. So in our tradition, in the Catholic tradition that I was raised in too, that's not true. And so ideologically, we're really different about women's and people's rights. Whereas when you switch over and you go over to the Protestant or Orthodox or like King James version, or, you know, even more, like there's so many different variations on Christianity now. But if you go over to Protestant, loosely defined, then you'll see that they actually took the woman, the thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and they put that in with thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. So the legal kind of semantics around that, and especially because King James himself did this, and as king at this time, he had the right of God behind him, according to the Anglican faith, the English church. And so because he was supposedly divinely inspired by this whole concept, the English people just had to go along with it. So English women now are not people, they're property. And Catholic women are people, not property. And how did they do this? You're like, yeah, but Amanda, that means that they got rid of one. What did they change it out with? What did they replace it with? Well, it's at the very beginning of the 10 Commandments, you know, the first two. So the first one is love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, blah, 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 blah. And thou shalt not make for yourself a graven image, da, 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 da. Now, the Catholic Church, way back in the day, is basically like all lawyers. They're all philosophers, they're all lawyers, they're all people who've been reading. But the early church is a lot of like legalities, because around this time, there's no science yet, not the discipline we have today, and not the industry we have today. Lawyers and doctors are kind of the authority on law and what's allowed and passable in society. when the king decided to put women in with objects, that actually carried down in various ways, policy-wise. And not saying that any policy got done under King James, because, like I said, he completely dismissed the legislature. So the parliamentarians weren't able to actually do their work, and they were often pressing him to get back to work because they were entitled to. But that being said, they also had all of their title and all of their... Anyways, it's a messy, messy mess. I don't want to get into it. It's too messy. And so in the Protestant tradition, you have 2 commandments made out of the first one. You love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And lawyers would usually say, okay, and then there's clauses, you know, like exceptions and stuff like that. And when you read the Bible, it's kind of laid out like that. Like there's the key line and then da, 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 da. Well, in the Old Testament, because when we're talking about the commandments, we're talking about the Old Testament, you know, love your God with all your heart, soul, might, right? And then right under that, it says, thou shalt not make for you graven images or what have you. And in the Protestant Reformation, they were so disgusted with the materialism of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church, and also the iconography of like the Orthodox churches in the East, that Protestant aesthetic became minimalist, if you will. They didn't want to make pictures of God anymore. They thought it was heretical to try to imagine it. In that way, we have Marie-Catharine d'Aulnoy, who is growing up, a French woman, and she was actually forced to marry at 15. And she's still a child. We talked about this. But back at this point, although the French didn't consider women objects in the literal sense, this culture that she's living in is very difficult. At this time, this is pre-revolution France, women were not allowed to work. They were not allowed to inherit money. And even if they were the last surviving member of a family, even if they had title, especially maybe if they had title. And believe it or not, women were highly discouraged from marrying for love. Often people say that marrying for love was banned in different parts of Europe. Well, in France, it wasn't banned at this time. It was just very uncommon because marriage is considered a tool. Marriage at this time is something that only the rich do. Like the poor have unions. They don't get married. Marriage is for like lords and ladies, and they have these pompous ceremonies filled with like materialism and symbolism, and it's gross. So this is one of the things that feeds into that Protestant Reformation. But that being said, Marie-Catharine is growing up in this. This is what she lives in France. And France is very materialistic at this point. Poverty also becomes extremely severe. Because when you have this kind of like extreme wealth and extravagance, it's usually in the face of this extreme poverty. And if you've ever read or watched or seen Les Misérables, the story, the play, the theater performance, whatever, whichever version you prefer, if you've ever experienced that emotional voyage, then you're experiencing mid-revolution France. You're experiencing people who have just had the last straw break their back because they're done. They are done. They know that their life isn't great, and it's not going to get better if they don't figure something out. And when you have poverty this extreme, when it's getting this extreme, and you have this many limits on women's mobility, they can't inherit, they can't make money, marriage becomes the only way out. You want to move up to nobility because that's how you can kind of guarantee your children's wealth too. That's how you set yourself up pretty in the patriarchy. But Marie-Catharine was sitting dap smack in the middle of one of the single most stifling moments of patriarchy. This was one of the worst examples that ever existed of patriarchal control over women. And unlike the repression of Victorian England, there's no single female in power anywhere at this point in Europe. There are many married women in power, but we're in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition. We're in the middle of the witch trials, right? So single women are being targeted. There aren't any in power. There aren't. And so this becomes a way for the patriarchy to keep the ego, the female public ego, in check. This sort of stuff was fed into really easily because of people like King James. King James that we're talking about from Scotland/England, he actually really got into the witch hunt craze and made it part of the propaganda around his marriage, that his marriage took so long and he couldn't go get his wife from the continent because witches were, you know, controlling the ocean and the waves and trying to drown them while they're at sea and blah, blah, blah. What do we do? How do we get into this story that we're talking about? Well, let's get into it. First, we're going to read Hans Christian Andersen's tale, The Princess and the Pea. And then we're going to read the Brothers Grimm. Okay, they had a story called The Pea Test. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about those stories side by side. But I want to just point out to you right now that both of those stories are written by men. The Brothers Grimm are both brothers, and Hans Christian Andersen is a man. All three of them, technically, are white European men. And they are writing almost 150 years after Comtesse Marie-Catharine de Neuilly. Now, the reason we wanted to talk about her is because before we get into the stories, she literally invented fairy tales. She published a book called Contes des Fées, which literally stands for Stories of the Fairies, or the fairies' stories. So fairy tales. And she coined that term. It's also within these stories that she coined terms like Prince Charmant, which stands for Prince Charming. There's so many things that she laid the groundwork for. And if you go back and you analyze her stories specifically, you will see that she is making a feminist critique of what's going on around her. And she's using her stories to couch her criticism. And part of it is because if she were to outright criticize the men around her and the organizations and groups around her, she would very much find herself the target of their agenda. She's trying to show that women are tough. Her story characters are tough ladies that endure ridiculous amounts of pain. Through this, she's advocating for women to have more control in their lives. She makes it almost satirical in the way that she's analyzing society and how we behave. There are many researchers who have analyzed fairy tales, and there's actually a whole discipline of folklore studies. I'm not a folklorist. I'm not a specialist, but I see patterns and I see attempts to gain power, attempts to gain or maintain control. And I think that when it comes to women and our stories, we often lose control. Now, 100 and some odd years later, first Hans Christian Andersen would start publishing tales. And then the Grimms too. They would be up on it and publishing stories. The Comtesse Marie-Catharine, she made it an act of rebellion to tell fairy tales. With the printing press newly out and available too, it was possible to print short forms, pamphlets and such. And this is often also how propaganda gets spread. This is also how later on in the Industrial Revolution, Charles Dickinson would actually publish his stories in a serialized way, pieces at a time. One of the other big hallmarks of difference between what the countesses were doing with fairy tales and what later groups and writers and authors did was that they would change the base of power in the story, and they would also change how much influence women had within these stories. And this is where Princess and the Pea becomes really perfect as a case study. The Princess and the Pea as a story is really well known because it's short, succinct, and it has this really interesting point to it. I recently wrote a blog post about hypersensitivity, or being a highly sensitive person. And being a highly sensitive person is something that is touched upon in The Princess and the Pea. In fact, this sensitivity is what supposedly makes a noble woman, according to Andersen anyways. The Grimms have a slightly different perspective. And this perspective, these differences, are where we're going today. Let's get into the stories. This is the Hans Christian Andersen version of The Princess and the Pea. Once upon a time, there was a prince who wanted to marry a princess, but she would have to be a real one. He traveled around the whole world looking for her, but every time he met a princess, there was always something amiss. There were plenty of princesses, but not one of them was quite to his taste. Something was always the matter. They just weren't real princesses. So he returned home very sad and sorry, for he had set his heart on marrying a real princess. That's a whole paragraph to emphasize how much this prince wants a real princess, not a fake one. Okay, it can't have Mattel stamped on the bottom of it. It's got to be a real princess. And so you can see there's this objectification here. This isn't a person, it's a thing. He wants a thing. So let's continue. One evening, a storm broke over the kingdom. The lightning flashed, the thunder roared, and the rain came down in bucketfuls. In the midst of this horrible storm, someone knocked on the city gate, and the king himself went down to open it. On the other side of the gate stood a princess. But goodness, how wet she was! Water ran down her hair and her clothes in streams. It flowed in through the heels of her shoes and out through the toes. But she said that she was a real princess. We'll find out that quickly enough, thought the old queen. But she didn't say a word out loud. See? She's seen, not heard. She hurried to the guest room and took all the bedclothes off the bed. Then, on the bare bedstead, she put a pea. On top of the pea, she put 20 mattresses. And on top of the mattresses, 20 eiderdown quilts. That was the bed on which the princess had to sleep. In the morning, when someone asked her how she had slept, she replied, "Oh, just wretchedly. I didn't close my eyes once the whole night through. God knows what was in that bed, but it was something hard, and I am black and blue all over." Now they knew that she was a real princess, since she had felt the pea that was lying on the bedstead through 20 mattresses and 20 eiderdown quilts. Only a real princess could be so sensitive. The prince married her. The pea was exhibited in the Royal Museum, and you can go there and see it if it hasn't been stolen. Now that was a real story. So not only is he saying, like, it's a real story right at the end, like he's trying to confirm that this is a real story, like honest. This is a tale that's as old as time. Honest. Like, this is awful. There's no true autonomy. Everything the queen does is not the queen's actions. Those are the king's actions. She's just an extension of him in this story and in this society. So we're going to read the Grimm's fairy tale version next. And this one is, I prefer this version myself, but it's not necessarily better. It's just as much propaganda, honestly. Listen up, and I'll add my comments where we go. Now, the other thing to consider too here is to watch where the agency is. In the beginning, it was established at the very beginning. It was the prince and the king want a real princess, real, trademark it. Has to come from Disney. I'm just kidding. But because of this, all of the movement through the rest of the story has to do with that. And this is kind of where we get the drive and the impetus for fantasy storytelling. Some higher authority, some force beyond us, could be nobility, could be God, could be what have you, could be spirit of some kind, in the fantasy realm, moves reality. And everybody else just has to keep up. The queen decides, all right, I'm going to put a P here. And she is part of the kingdom. She's part of testing this woman and seeing if she is a real princess. It's told so obviously a matter of fact that it's like, this happened once, but it's true, and it's something that we would do again if we could. And the P is in the museum because it's not the woman who made herself a princess. She's not a princess because she is a princess. She's a princess because the P, the noun, the object proved that this other object is objectively that object. I know this sounds like a lot of weird catch-22 stuff, but that's exactly the crap that is in patriarchal thought. It doesn't make any real sense. It's a belief system that people believe in because it serves them somehow, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's a narrative. It's a story we tell ourselves. So let's get into the second story. And remember, this one is called the P test. And eventually the Grimm's brothers pulled their copy from circulation, I believe because, and this is alleged because I can't remember and I couldn't find the source that I originally read it from, but I believe that there was some kick up from the Andersen estate about the P test story, and there was a lot of tension between these storytellers at the time because they're also from different regions, different places. So there's tension. Here is Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's P test, the P test. Once upon a time, there was a king whose only son was very eager to get married. And he asked his father for a wife. Your wish shall be fulfilled, my son, said the king. But it's only fitting that you marry no one less than a princess, and there are none to be had in the vicinity. Therefore, I shall issue a proclamation, and perhaps a princess will come from afar. So the first one is, in Andersen's tale, the prince tried, he failed. So now the king's like, yeah, okay, we'll get you a princess. All right, don't worry. And then a princess wanders in one night. Just knock, knock, knock on a rainy night. Boom, lucky. Let's test her and make sure she's noble. And then you can marry her. In this one, the son went to his father and said, can I have a princess, pretty please? Can I have one, daddy, please? And so you see there's like a different impetus. The push is coming from the prince first, then from the king. The king confirms it. And so the prince is almost allowed to have some autonomy in the story and have some authority within the story. Does that make sense? There's a slight difference here between the two men in the beginning and their distribution of power and autonomy. And it's not a bad thing. I like this difference. Then the king is saying too, like, we're going to make it happen. I'm going to make it happen. I'm the king. I'm going to make it happen for you. Okay. So it's only fitting that you marry not one less than a princess. No one less than a princess. So he needs a princess or better. So there's this kind of, it's more like a standard. It's more like a boundary. She's got to be on this side of that boundary. Whereas the other one was like, is she real or not real? It was princess or not. It was yes or no. It was black or white. This is lots of gray zones. Therefore I shall issue a proclamation, and perhaps a princess will come from afar. Soon a written proclamation was circulated, and it did not take long before numerous princesses arrived at the court. Circulated. They're already using this terminology about putting news out, right? We're talking about propagating stories, propagating stories, planting those story seeds, watching them grow. So the proclamation was circulated, and it did not take long before numerous princesses arrived at court. Almost every day a new one appeared, but when the princesses were asked about their birth and lineage, it always turned out that they were not princesses at all. See, the word real isn't in here. The word real isn't being used. And that's where the gray happens. That's where that gray zone is created. When you don't paint a line down the middle, it's not black and white, which is great because it allows for way more room. It always turned out they were not princesses, and they were sent away without having achieved their purpose. Oof, purpose. Their purpose is what? To marry a noble person, aka all these people pretending to be princesses are being turned out. If everything continues like this, the son said, I'll never get a wife in the end. Calm yourself, my son, said the queen. Before you know it, she'll be here. Happiness is often standing just outside the door. One need only open it. Now, this story is interesting because it also pulls out some more imagery from the Bible, and I'll share it with you. Number one, the queen is actually able to speak in this story. This queen has a voice and she uses it. So that's another reason why I like the Grimm brothers. She says, happiness is often standing just outside the door. One only needs to open it. What door is she even talking about? Well, in the Bible, Jesus basically advocates and says, if you need something from God, just ask for it. If you need something from, your betters, ask for it. Put it out there. And he says, knock and the door shall be opened unto you. He's saying, ask. You have to knock for what you want and need. And that's part of the ideology behind advocacy in the West. Western society really, really treasures our process of advocacy and advocating for people who need support and help. And we believe in doing that, especially if people are struggling. And part of that is because even Jesus advocated for people. And I'm not trying to proselytize. Like I said, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I grew up on the story of Jesus. I grew up with the Bible. This is intrinsically part of Western culture. And if I want to tell you where a bunch of these other ideas come from, we have to talk a little bit about Jesus. Like, the dude's all up in Western society. The queen has a voice. She's sitting there, and the Grimm's brother they're basically invoking the Bible in this passage here. The queen is giving a spiritual reminder to the prince. She's saying, stay steady, have faith. Happiness is standing just outside the door. And the story continues, one needs only open that door. And it really was just as the queen had predicted. Soon after, on a stormy evening when the wind and rain were beating on the windows, there was a loud knocking on the gate of the royal palace. The servants opened the gate, and a beautiful maiden entered. She demanded to be led directly before the king, who was surprised by such a late visit and asked her where she had come from, who she was, and what she desired. And guess what? In this story, she is a voice. Not only does she demand these things and get put before the king, right? She's actually fulfilling the queen's prediction. She's literally knocking on the door. And the prince is the one who literally has to open the door to let her in. So this princess, this is a little bit of foreshadowing, because the princess that is real, although they don't use the term real here, the true princess, the one that will pass this test, this P test, implied by the title, she's already behaving in a Christ-like fashion before she even opens her mouth. She's knocking on the door to get what she wants. Okay. And this could also be one of the reasons why this story was taken away, was stopped printing, you know, why the Grimm's brothers removed it from their later copies of the same book. Partially because this woman has so much agency and she's behaving in a Christ-like fashion, which demonstrates that she's a person, not an object, not a noun. So between the two stories, you can see how males have a wide variety at this time of treating women within literature, within stories, within their own narratives. "I've come from a distant country," she answered, "and I'm the daughter of a mighty king. When your proclamation with the portrait of your son arrived in my father's kingdom, I felt a strong love for your son and immediately set out on my way with the intention of becoming his bride." "I'm somewhat skeptical about what you've told me," said the king. "Besides, you don't look like a princess. Since when does a princess travel alone without an escort and in such poor clothes?" And it's interesting here because the Grimm's brothers are setting the king up for a slight failure here. So you can see they're actually undermining this claim that kings had to divine, you know, correctness. You know, you couldn't necessarily tell a king he was wrong. So what do? You tell a story in which a king is wrong. Let's keep going and keep that in mind. "An escort would have only delayed me," she replied. "The color of my clothes faded in the sun, and the rain washed it out completely. If you don't believe I'm a princess, just send a messenger to my father." So now she's deferring to her father. She's saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry if I've offended you, or you don't believe me because I'm a lowly woman. If you must, talk to my dad, send a letter, send a messenger, whatever." "That's too far and too complicated," said the king. "A delegation cannot ride as fast as you. The people must have the necessary time for such a journey. Years would pass before they returned. If you can't prove in some other way that you're a princess, then fortune will not shine upon you, and you'd do well to head for home. The sooner the better." So the king's basically trying to turn her out, and she's like, "Nah." "Let her stay," the queen said. "I'll put her to a test and know soon enough whether she's a princess." The authority, the female authority, is saying, let me take on the responsibility for deciding, is she one of us? Is she of my kind? Is she of my ilk? Right? Is she a woman like me? Is she noble like me? And the king and they're all kind of in the dark about, who is this chick? She just showed up on our door. But again, the foreshadowing is there. There's a bunch of these small Christian elements that hint to us that she is who she says she is. And all of these authorities in the story are being set up to not so much look like a fool, but to be proven to be fallible. So they're not wrong. The P test doesn't prove anybody wrong, but it proves that our human understanding, whether we're king or queen or commoner alike, is fallible. So I really like this version for this reason. Let me continue. "The queen herself climbed up into the tower and had a bed made up for the maiden in a splendid room. When the mattress was carried into the room, she placed 3 P's on it, one on top, one in the middle, and one below. Then 6 other soft mattresses were stacked on top, along with linen sheets and a cover made of eiderdown. When everything was ready, she led the maiden upstairs into the bedroom. 'After such a long trip, you must be tired, my child,' she said. 'Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll continue talking.' At the break of day, the queen climbed up to the room in the tower. She thought the maiden would still be in a deep sleep, but the maiden was awake. 'How did you sleep, my little daughter?' she asked. 'Miserably,' replied the princess. 'I couldn't sleep a wink the whole night.' 'Why, my child? Wasn't the bed good enough?' Now here we have to pause for 2 seconds because this is tricky. You know, when I go stay at someone else's house and they're like, hey, how'd you sleep? How's the bed? I don't want to tell them it's crap, even if it is. And these princesses are really just being like, nah, I can do better. They're like, no, this sucks. And I'm not sure if I'd be able to tell anyone that. Wasn't the bed good enough? She says, in all my days, I've never lain in such a bed. It was hard from my head to my feet. It seemed as if I was lying on nothing but peas. Oh, now I know for sure, said the queen, that you're a genuine princess. I shall send some royal garments up to you with pearls and jewels. Dress yourself as a bride, for we shall celebrate your wedding this very day. So as you can see, the decision for her to be a princess and get married too is made right there by the queen. The queen's like, you proved it to me. I'm going to make sure I pass that on to the king. This is the decision that I'm given to the king, and he can make his decision. But the interesting thing is, as the queen, as half of the royal consort pair, she's making a decision for herself and her own beliefs. And she's not absconding or relying on her husband to support that concept at the end of the story. We don't hear the king confirm her beliefs. We just hear the queen say, yeah, genuine, real deal, awesome, let's do this. There's a recognition between women there. And so this story seems almost more realistic, more likable to me anyways. In that way, it makes it more convincing propaganda, doesn't it? Here is my retelling of The Princess and the Pea. What I'd like to do is demonstrate that there's a lot of changes to the story. There is no princess. There is no singular pea. There's no billions of mattresses. I've changed a lot of the symbolism and also the motif a little. And it also wouldn't fall into the same folklore story section. So I've changed it. It's not really the same story anymore. So you may be disappointed. I hope that it seems more authentic and more like a story that women would tell each other than these other two versions, which were told by men and which are about testing true womanhood. And so when you go into it, you'll see there's no propaganda styling here. I'm not trying to tell women how to be. I'm also not trying to tell women what makes a true woman out of a woman. There's only one kind of authority in the story. There's the individual and the authenticity that someone can bring to a relationship. And then there's the authority of the community and how a group of people can react to a singular person. This is a story that I'm trying to kind of bring back from the edge of fairy tale, and I'm trying to bring it back towards more myth. What was the original myth or tale that women told each other that led to men creating this kind of a story? And I bet there is some sort of much older version of the P test, but I think that both versions are tales that propagate this idea of women as objects ultimately to move the agenda, the political and expansionist agenda of colonial Western society. My story is to undermine, usurp, to get rid of all of that. I wanted to bring it back to nature. I wanted to bring it back to the base of society. This is the story of the village that gave refuge to Our Lady, Fabacea, Mother of Peace. Once upon a time, there was a small walled-in community in a land in northwestern Europe, very far from here. Its name exists no longer. In that land, before stories were written, was a community of first families that discovered a grotto. Discovering ancient stones, carvings, and designs, the people realized that this was an ancient well that they could use instead of digging a new one. Soon, the villagers came to rely on this well and the surrounding grotto. They cleared the choke vines, they collected the greens for dinner, and they swept the ancient stone path, removing hazards for those who require assistance and clearance while walking. The people prepared the grotto, but every day there were new vines growing in the clearing, wrapping around the well, twisting between trees, and climbing up towards the road. There was a family that distinguished itself in refurbishing the grotto, and they became responsible for the grotto. They were torn. Their work was becoming all-consuming, as if the vines came back magically overnight. The growth seemed like it fought the people. The family leading the work began to take it personally. The family also had a large flock of animals to tend, to feed and care for. These animals required seasonal tending, such as mating, birthing, raising, training. The animals needed shearing in the spring, and the wool processed and sold. The fiber would support their household goods for the year, and they were using much of it in the tending of the grotto daily. They were going to run out early this year if they didn't find a solution to this excessive growth at the grotto. One night, as the family's mother was finishing her work at the grotto, she knelt at the well while fetching a pail and prayed for a solution. On her way back to the village, a hard and heavy rain fell, and only the gods came out to play in the sky, lighting up the world with their violence. That same night, a mysterious woman arrived in the community. She was wet, cold, and alone. She rode a single horse, but her clothing and belongings seemed properly made. The woman wore foreign clothes, spoke a language no one knew, but she was kind and was capable of being understood regardless. She was able to communicate to the community that she was in fact a leader from a neighborhood community. The walled community let her in, even though they weren't sure if they believed her claims. They were kind enough to give her a bed for the night and tend to her needs before they assumed she would continue traveling. They fed her and offered her warm water for washing. She found their hospitality warmed her heart the same way the water warmed her frozen fingers. The woman wore clothes much lighter in color and weight than the walled community's women. Her clothes were so pale they almost were as white as a daisy. The fiber was unknown to them. They marveled, but were unable to ask the woman for details, and weren't sure it was appropriate to ask anyways. They weren't even sure how to ask her. The women in the community, like the men, were used to wearing gray and brown fibers made from the furs and hairs of local animals. The women, as a group, began to watch this strange woman and reported on her to each other. The women remarked, chatting with each other and agreeing that the clothing was thin but strong, pale but warm. When they touched it, the smooth texture of the strands seemed impossible to the wool-laden community. The woman who was visiting began to realize that the community was very open within the walls. It had no trees or plants. The cool winds that slid down the mountainside would cross through the village on their way to the sea and cut through the woman's gentle fibers, unlike those of the local community. Cold, the woman asked to be allowed to camp outside of the village, but inside the forest that was under their care. Nestled into the crook of the mountain's foothills, the grotto did not experience the same winds. The family responsible for working the grotto welcomed her to come one day during shearing season, and when she offered to look after the grotto while the family was busy processing wool, they were overcome with relief. The father didn't believe there was anything to hurt, and that the worst that could happen is that the stranger might allow the grotto to become overgrown. But the family would clear it when they came back, as they planned to anyway. Perhaps, the family's mother thought, this was an answer to her prayers. The community women began going to the grotto so that there was always at least 2 women who came to check on the strange woman each day. The women of the community stopped being offended at her presence now that she was safely on the outside of the village's walls. but they were still enamored with her unique character and traits, and often became curious about her. If the women of the village couldn't check on her themselves, they sent their children up to check on her and to report back. Unknown to the community, not only did the strange woman come from a larger nation, she came from one that had developed an agricultural method for developing grains. She didn't have the words that this community used. She couldn't speak their language, but she could see that they did not have this ability. And yet they were a smart and kind people. The woman knew, and it was the reason that she set out on pilgrimage, that she was very sick and would soon die. She didn't have any words to explain this to the community, but before she passed, she wanted to give something back in gratitude for all that they had given her. When she was shown the grotto, the woman felt a peace that moved her. After weeks in this strange community, the grotto offered her refuge in the same way that the community had the rainy night that she had arrived. She turned a shed into an overnight shelter, and as she slept, she had a dream that the grotto was meant to be more than just a watering hole. She realized that where she came from had ruins like this too. A peace came over her as she realized in falling asleep that she could give back to the community by showing them the same generosity they showed her. She began working on collecting each of the vine plants the next morning. As she replanted them along the path to the grotto, using old twigs to tease them up the hill the way they like. Toward the path, she blessed them and named each of them. Their names were pea, lentil, chickpea, clover, and many others. She taught the ladies of the village that when they came to visit and have lunch with her, or supper, she taught them to throw their plant refuse on top of the climbing plant spaces and roots. Soon, the village saw that the climbers had the most beautiful of flowers, and the pale color reminded the people of the strange woman. When they looked closer at the flowers, the villagers saw different things. The women saw the visage of the strange woman in a bonnet looking back at them, smiling. The men saw something more suggestive, but in a variety of colors: pale whites, yellows, pinks, reds, and violets. Every day, villagers came to the grotto to celebrate the work that the woman was doing, enjoying trellises of pea flowers and giving the strange woman much joy in her labor. The plants continued to grow faster and hardier than the strange woman was familiar with, but she assumed that this was because she had much to teach the village before she would die. When the village was done shearing, cleaning, and processing, and now the daughters were turning the woolen fibers, much of the village's women began coming back in large groups to the grotto. Some to rest, finally. Others to satisfy their curiosity. The pea flowers grew into pods, and the pods began to grow fat, and every day there was change. The village women had never heard of peas or beans, but had known that the natural world held more foods. They watched the woman tend the plants. They continued to throw their animal and kitchen waste on the roots of the vines, and the vines grew thicker and hardier. As more women and children came to get water from the grotto, rather than the village well, they spilled water on the roots of the plants, and children splashed each other, offering the plants a drink every time. The woman made a basket out of the late-season rush reeds and the vines of the pea, weaving the vines and putting them in a tree above the fire. The women copied her, making baskets with her, pulling the excessive vines that would cross the paths, choke the sacred trees, or had no flowers or pods upon them. Half a moon passed. The baskets dried, and the pea pods fattened, going pale like the woman's clothes. The trees began changing color, giving omens of winter to the village and the strange woman. The woman pulled down her basket, and the village women copied her. They began harvesting the peas, placing them in the baskets, and later emptying the pods into the baskets after washing with grotto water. Then the woman and the village together put the baskets up in the trees above a smoky fire. The peas shriveled up like grapes, but were far more firm. As the peas dried, the woman ripped up the vines, clearing the grotto and the vine beds. She put all of the vines into a pit. She mashed them, adding water and bringing a lodestone down over the plants. This process seemed almost familiar to the community, and they joined her once they saw that she began to weave the fibers while they were wet. The fibers were twined and worked, and the village was surprised at the second fiber with different characteristics. One night, after the peas were dried and stored in clay jars inside the community walls, the strange woman invited the entire village to a feast that she would host. She would teach them finally the meal that most excited her about the legume. The villagers were grateful to the strange but discerning woman that the hunters went out to get a boar, one large enough to feed the village as a whole. The village became so excited about the strange woman's feast that they invited friends and neighbors from the neighboring shared territories, and each of these small families brought even more food to feast with. As the feast began, the woman ladled out what she called peas pudding, which is a thick pea soup. She made it with the drippings of the boar, the local swamp onions, and other items that were offered to her by villagers with goods. As more people and food showed up, the entire community was able to try her delicacy and decide whether they liked it or not. Regardless, there was food for all. She and the villagers began to understand that they had seen beans, peas, and other creeper seeds, but they had not understood the origins or how they came by such a food product. The woman had a feast such as she'd never had in all her life, and overcome with gratitude and joy, she sat at the grotto's well and cried tears of joy. Her relief was so absolute that she sighed and passed away right there on the step of the well. As she sighed into death, she relaxed as though falling into sleep, knowing she had done all she could with the time she was given. The spirit of the grotto received her gently, and by morning, when the villagers came to draw water, they found the well undisturbed, but she was gone. In her place grew a robust pea plant, its vines thick and lush, and its root as strong as a tree. From that day on, the villagers claimed the woman as their own and gave her a name, Fabacea, meaning dinner of beans. Her spirit fed them still. Through the coldest months, they gathered her peas, dried them, and feasted. And today, though her grotto and well are lost to history, her name remains. We call her Our Lady Fabacea, Lady of Legumes, Mother of Peas. What I was looking to do, I think I achieved with this story. There's some tightening I want to do on this story, some corrections I caught as I was reading it. Let me know what you think, either down below the show notes on YouTube or on your favorite social media where we're located. You can find that. You can also come to my website, 𝐓𝐢𝐻𝐿𝐭𝐚𝐦𝐩𝐬, and leave your notes about my story. I think that I was able to remove the colonizing narrative, the idea that women have specific roles and that's dictated by the story. I wanted to remove that completely. So let me know if I did it, if I'm successful. Further, for the whole first month after a story is shared on Storytime, I'm going to have these stories and research packages that come out on my website, 𝐓𝐢𝐻𝐿𝐭𝐚𝐦𝐩𝐬, and they're downloadable. They'll be digital, and you can print them at home or what have you. They'll be free for the first 30 days usually. But this month, because I'm also going to be going to FanCon in Prince George for the first weekend of May, the long weekend, I wanted it to be free then as well. So I'm going to make an extension on this. This package, the Princess and the Pea package, which is going to have a Princess and the Pea series of coloring pages. It's also going to have one of my more recent coloring pages. I did one of Gisèle Pellicot from France. And so I'm going to insert that into this package too. So basically all of the coloring pages I come out with for April, all of the research I do, everything that has to do with this episode will be in that package, and it'll come out after the episode does, and you'll be able to download it for free. Yeah. And if there's a code you have to use to get it for free, it'll be on the screen right now. And I want to do this on the regular. If you follow my podcasts and you tune in every week, you'll be able, or, well, I suck at this. I am very slow at editing. I'm also very slow at writing and research because I'm very thorough. I go very deep into things. As you can tell, we touched on all sorts of topics and content today. I am pretty anxious, so I have to get into the habit of doing this. It's going to take a while for me to get into the habit. So going forward, I'm hoping to do a new episode bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks. And I'll be recording midway through the week. I'm going to try and get them out over the weekend when I can. And there will always be a digital download package with research sources and any other kind of tools, kits, or coloring pages and printables every time. And so there's a lot of research that goes into this project, and I want to do a really good job. And because I'm a bit of a detail-oriented person, it can slow me down. And so please excuse me as I learn and develop this podcast as we go. This isn't something I received funding for right from the get-go. This was a project first. And I started teaching myself this project and going through it and developing it. And I'm just really excited to finally share it with you and to start telling you stories that we should all know. We should know what's going on here when people tell us these stories, and the history, the things that we've learned about these things. It's not common. It's not common information or knowledge, but it has a huge affect of how women are treated in our society and what we tolerate publicly as communities, as women. So I hope that this version is a little more nuanced, but I also hope that it tickles someone's fancy somewhere. And I'm not trying to compete with the Princess Tale. I'm just trying to add my own interpretation or take on it. And I think I did. I think we're good now. And I will share a copy of that story in the printable, so you can have your own copy for your kids or just for yourself. And if you have any other suggestions or ideas for me, let me know, because I have a lot to cover in the future, and chances are it's probably already lined up in the queue as far as ideas and development. There's multiple places and stories that I've researched to create episodes coming soon, so please stay tuned. I can't always say at this point which topic or which story is going to make it to the next episode, because at this point I'll film and record and go to edit, and if it doesn't work out, sometimes I just drop it and move on to the next topic because I know I can do it faster. So at the moment, I'm not always certain exactly what's coming up next. It's kind of whatever makes it through the whole pipeline of development next. That being said, I do have key topics for this podcast. They are womanhood, nature, wisdom, language, and culture. And so these are the key themes around which I hope to chat with you, and I hope to help us develop and change the world. If you made it all the way to the end, show me your favorite food emoji. Your favorite food one. Like, I don't know, is there a pea emoji? I wonder if there is just like a green, round green thing. I think mine is probably like the coffee cup emoji out of all the food ones. I also know that there's like little sushi emojis now too, and Oh, I love the world we live in. It's so interesting as far as like what people are creating. And I just really wanted to share with you my love of story, my love of women's narratives and women's realities. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about propaganda because, you know, when you see that storytelling is co-opted just to make women feel a certain way in society, it's really easy to look at modern politics and see the exact same thing going on. You know, it becomes a new lens that we see the world through. So I hope that this is a lens that I hope it's not completely new to all people, but I hope it's new to some folks. And if it is, let me know, because that's kind of the thing. You don't know how people are trying to control the narrative or control your perspective of them and the situation until you really start to analyze the language they're using and how they tell their story. So today we started. This is a segment called Storytime, but every episode is going to be a different segment. So once a month I'll have a story time. Every episode isn't going to be a story time analysis like this. I promise. It's quite deep. It's quite in depth, but I wanted to make sure I showed everyone in my first episode what I'm capable of, how deep I'm able to go, the importance of the things we're talking about. Can't be overstated. We are talking about women's realities and taking back our own stories. And when we do that, we also take back our own power and control in a situation. And if in this world, which is developing fast and quickly, and it's beautiful, it's also very scary. It's also very dangerous. And sometimes we don't know what kind of scary things lurk out there for us. So in the tradition of women telling each other stories to support one another, to help inform and educate one another, and also to entertain, I hope I met these goals for you today. Stay tuned. We'll have a lot more for you on this channel soon. And like I said, they're not all going to be story times. There's going to be different segments. So please subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Right now, I think my mom is the only one subscribed. So please follow me if you love stories and you love women.